Joining us on Talking Sense today, Deputy Finance Minister Ashor Sarupen. Hello, Ashor. Great to have you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Gabriel.
So I want to do the majority of our conversation. I want to focus on the budget the medium-term budget you've just passed, because I think it really is an excellent piece of policy that you have managed to pass and get over the line here. And I think it signals many of the slow improvements that have happened in this new kind of GNU dispensation. But before we start on any of that, maybe if you could give a kind of brief background as to who you are and how you've ended up as the Deputy Finance Minister of the country.
I suppose I ended up as the Deputy Finance Minister because of politics, as we all do. I was involved in the Democratic Alliance since 2006, which is a long time now, 19 years. I was elected to the Ekurhuleni City Council in 2011 as a city councillor. I was the DA's chief whip there for a period of time. I then went off to the Gauteng legislature for a few years, where I was one of the party spokespersons on the finance committee. In that time, sort of studied as well, completed an MBA, Masters in Corporate Strategy, Masters in International Business through Wits and Gibbs. Went to Parliament in 2019, was on the Finance and Appropriations Committees. I could go through all the political work, but that's not all that interesting, really. I held many political positions in the DA. And then in 2024, when the GNU happened, I guess the DA saw me as the most qualified person for the job, and so here we are.
Well, and so before we talk about this new budget that has been passed and the kind of specifics inside of it and why it seems to, what the kind of improvements that it signals are, I think it's important that we establish some context for the listeners at home, because it's very confusing, the kind of government budget, because you guys spend so much money and you take in so much money, but the process by which, the allocation happens and all of things, it remains pretty obscure to the average South African. So let's start off kind of on the base level. How much money does the South African government spend, and how does it spend that money?
We spend approximately 2 trillion rand a year.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we spend that money? A large chunk of it goes to healthcare and education. A very big chunk of it goes to debt. About 21% of it goes to debt. And then once you account for pretty much debt, what we call the social wage, which is health, education, building RDP houses, which is sort of very small actually, and safety and so on, that accounts for 60% of the budget. And then you've got 20% left for everything else, which includes infrastructure and other critical things that we need to do that everyone demands, because we've got this weird situation in South Africa where people think that every problem is the government's problem to solve, and we only really have 20% of the budgets once you account for interest and the social wage to solve all those problems. And the bulk of that should be infrastructure, of course, because that's where you get the biggest growth multiplier. And we've been trying to rebalance the expenditure, because for the last 15 years or so, the South African government's budget was focused on consumption and not investment. Now, what does that mean? We were buying things, we were SAA spending 20 rand on a bottle of water. We've seen all the worst excesses of consumptive expenditure and how that gets lost through corruption. But not enough went into investment, and particularly fixed investment. And so one of the many markers for our economy being weak is what we call gross fixed capital formation, which is the amount of fixed assets being created in the economy. And there we've not had nearly enough. The South African economy can only really grow when you get 20% gross fixed capital formation plus. We've been at around 15 to 16. And so the composition of government expenditure has been a problem for the longest time. And that is changed in this budget. So when you look at the macros, the reality is healthcare is not going to go away, and it shouldn't. Public healthcare.
Yeah.
It's a good investment to make when it is run properly. Public education, similarly, is not going away. It's a good investment when it's done properly.
Yes.
All sorts of social support systems are stabilizing effects in our economy and stabilizing effects in society. And you don't want to tear up social stability either.
Yes.
So you have got to then deal with this thing called the interest portion of the budget, which is 20%. And if you can deal with that, then you open up more pathways for investment and for other kinds of good fiscal policy. So if the less you pay on interest and so on, the more you can start looking at the tax system and making changes to reduce the tax burden of society as well. So that's about roughly what the composition looks like.
And so just to confirm on that, that means that 20%, you said 21%, so 1 in every 5 rands is spent on just servicing the debt of the government, right?
Yes.
So that means that, and you say you're spending 2 trillion rand, but just over 2 trillion rand a year. So the government has run up a lot of debt to have that kind of interest payment,
yes,
right?
We have over 6 trillion rands in debt. That is, so debt to GDP is at 77.9%. And of course, this isn't great because once upon a time, not that long ago, in 2008, debt to GDP was 27%. And debt service costs wasn't sort of 1% of the budget. It was kind of a rounding error.
Yeah.
And if you look at government budgets from 2008. And then, of course, we know what happened with the ANC's elective conference, which also coincided with the 2008 financial crisis. But then the long tail of the Jacob Zuma era sets in, and government debt just balloons. Our state-owned enterprise get captured and then have to get bailed out perpetually because it becomes a feeding trough for all sorts of corrupt networks. And the end point of that is that the state capture issue is not only about the institutions and the problems in the police and criminal justice and the capture of state-owned enterprises, but it's also the fiscal consequence that we live with now, which is that we have about 6 trillion rands worth of debt.
But why does a government kind of generally want to borrow money? Like, what is it trying to do to achieve there? And then where are you borrowing this? The 6 trillion rand of debt. Who's given this to the government, right? Have they gone to Capitec, asked for a small business loan? What's happened there?
Well, I mean, it would probably be more than a small business loan. I'm not sure if Capitec is the right group to borrow that scale of money from. So I think let's start with the second half of your question. Where does government borrow money? Governments borrow money primarily through the bond market. That's the one area. And then the second area that they borrow from is international financial institutions. So on the bond market, effectively, for anyone who doesn't know what a bond is, we basically issue a bond and we say, you give us this amount of money, 1 billion rand, 10 billion rand, 100 billion, however you're prepared. We go to auction, you can buy the bond, and it's a coupon bond. So what we will do is every year we will pay you just the interest portion on your capital for a period of time. You can get 3-year, 5-year, you can get 3-month bonds in some countries. 3-year, 5-year, 7-year, 13-year, all the way through to 30-year bonds.
Yes.
And we pay you the interest portion back, so you're getting the interest actively all the way through. And then at the end of that period, we give you your initial capital amount.
Okay.
And so it's kind of like the inverse of a home loan, where you're paying the interest portion as well as a capital portion over time. You pay, it changes over. It's actually the full amount on your loan is due at the end, and that is how the bond market, in the very simplistic way that I've just described, works.
Yes.
So that's where money comes from. South Africa is a very lucky country on the African continent. We have really well-developed capital markets that are very deep. So you've got big banks, you've got big institutional investors, pension funds and investment firms and those sorts of things. And so roughly 75% of the debt issuance every year that government puts to markets is bought out by the domestic economy. And 25% it's rand denominated. And so there's that. And 90% of South Africa's government debt is rand denominated. Only 10% is FX or foreign currency denominated. So we're not one of those jurisdictions who borrows in dollars, and then every time the exchange rate fluctuates, you have a balance of payments crisis.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So that covers, I think, the second half of your question. There was a first part to your question that I've missed.
Yes, which is, why is a government going out and borrowing money in the first place anyway?
The question is it good or bad for a government to borrow money? It is good for a government to borrow money if the government invests it in the things that will grow the economy. Now, largely, the private sector drives the economy and economic growth, and it is the job of government to create the right environment for business to grow. But part of that right environment is that you need functioning roads, is that you need the right kind of economic superstructure and so on.
Yes.
These things are big investments. Not all of them are the kinds of things where the private sector will put up all of the capital up front. And so there isn't a country in the world where you find the kind of economic superstructure is solely private sector funded. There's always either combination of government and private or government.
Yes.
And so that is where it's good for government to borrow money. Where is it bad for the government to borrow money is if you're going to use it to fund salaries, bottles of water that you for 20 rand a pop, and consumptive expenditure. So if you're borrowing for consumption, it's a very, very bad thing to do, and it's a sign of very, very bad fiscal management.
Yeah, and there's also a relationship that we kind of have hinted at in the way that we've talked about it, but we should make explicit here as well, is that the less debt that the government has, the less it has to, a kind of a line item in the budget that you have the debt service costs, right? And so the more the government borrows, there's actually an inverse relationship, because it seems the more the government borrows, the less money you actually have to spend on everything that isn't debt servicing.
Yes.
Because as your debt increases, your service cost increases. And so actually by bringing down government debt levels, you unlock a lot of capital to, reallocate to, more economically productive areas, right?
Yeah. So it's quite important in this medium-term budget. We've actually peaked debt to GDP this year after this dramatic rise from 27%, as I said, in 2008 to 77.9 now. It's now peaked, and it was critical to do that. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is the debt service cost issue. You've got to bring that down and not let that consume a bigger and bigger portion of the budget, of your public finance, because eventually you hit what they call a fiscal cliff, where you can basically cover your salaries and interest payments, and then government literally grinds to a halt because you're paying civil servants to pitch up to work and you're paying interest and nothing else. So it's important to avoid the fiscal cliff. And that was the first part of it. But there are other critical things. The higher your debt, the higher your risk premium, because the less likely people believe you will be able to service your debt. So in the global economy, there's what you call the risk-free rate, and that is what is the country least likely to default on its debt, usually the United States, biggest borrower globally, and what are the rates that they pay on their bonds, which is 4.5%, 5%. So globally, when you're competing for finance, which we all do, you're competing against a risk-free rate, and that is the risk-free rate. The higher your debt, the less borrowers will believe that you will be able to service your debt, the more interest they charge. And this creates a cycle where when you're on the wrong side of this, you end up borrowing at higher rates, which means that interest rates rise in your domestic economy as well. And when those rates rise, you start choking off growth because you then make it difficult for your firms and households to borrow for investment and credit and those sorts of things. And then that raises the cost of borrowing even more, and you end up in this vicious cycle.
Yes.
And if that cycle spins out of control, ultimately you end up in governments printing money, and then you end up with Zimbabwe and Venezuela, which you don't want to go down, a path you don't want to go down at all. So that's the second critical reason. And there's a third critical reason, and that is global sovereign debt will probably reach 100% of global GDP by the end of 2027, maybe early 2028. That is because governments all over the world are addicted to debt and borrowing.
Yes.
And they're addicted to freebies and so on. And it does not work. It does not result in positive economic outcomes, but unfortunately, here we are. At that point, borrowers are going to start looking to less risky jurisdictions. And we are now going to be one of the few countries in the world, at least on the fiscal policy front. We've got many problems in South Africa, but this is one of the many bright things, one of the few bright things, I guess, but one of the bright things in this country is because we're going the opposite direction to the rest of the world now, we will become a less risky jurisdiction, which means we will become even more attractive for investment as our risk-free rate is lower than what would be considered the global premium.
And that's like a really crucial point that you've brought up, is that you and your colleagues are moving the fiscal position in the right direction, right? But we weren't. This seems to be a kind of recent development within the GNU, because we had a budget earlier this year which on several occasions was promised to be the thing that would end the GNU and end this relationship that you have between the ANC and the DA. And now you cut forward to this medium-term budget, and there's an incredible amount of fiscal discipline being shown, the right type of thinking, and not only that, but there seems to be a kind of willingness on behalf of the ANC to accept some of the hard choices that they need to in order to have a kind of fiscally, disciplined budget. So how does how do you find yourself in this position? Because you've been at the coalface of this kind of dispute the whole time, and you've got to see the change in attitude, I guess, or the environment. What's gone on here?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing. I think the critical thing is last year in the NTBPS, which was the first budget policy statement of the GNU, the finance minister did announce that it was the intention to peak debt to GDP this year. So like at the inception of the GNU, there was a commitment to the markets, to the public, that we would start decreasing our scale of debt. And that was one of the things that needed to follow through. In between the medium-term budget policy statement and getting to budget 1.0, obviously there is inevitably fiscal demands, many fiscal demands. And the truth is, when you've had an economy that has grown as badly as ours, paltry 1.194% on average for 15 years, you're going to run into all sorts of budgetary problems. And so, yes, there are many things that are underfunded. Of course, there are many things where money's wasted as well. So two things can be true at once. We don't have enough money for nurses and teachers. We also waste a lot of money.
Yes.
And those things can be simultaneously true and are simultaneously true. So we got to that point, and we all remember the drama around that. And it almost was a calamity, I guess, for the government. But I suppose at the conclusion of that, what it did was it showed two things: that neither the DA nor the ANC were going to agree with each other on everything, and both parties have very strong and very different opinions. And neither side is prepared to effectively give up their core beliefs to the other.
Yes.
Neither of us are prepared to be swallowed up by the other. Neither of us prepared to. It's not a European-style coalition government in that sense, because in European coalitions, you write a 300-page coalition agreement, everyone agrees on everything, and you spend 5 years executing and implementing with this thing that you've agreed to.
Yes.
We don't have that here. So it's now very clear that the DA is wanting to demonstrate strength, wanting to demonstrate what we do well. The ANC wants to demonstrate that it is the ANC still. And so I think in a strange way, the two parties now have settled in this fact that we are going to have strong political differences. We are going to have big policy differences and so on. But when it comes to the critical things, we've got to find a way to figure it out. And I suppose the finance minister and I have been on a journey together, very different, ideologies, very different backgrounds. But as a consequence of being at the Treasury together and working together, you sort of find the halfway path. Now, I would obviously, being a good liberal, I would want to slash as much as I can, but but the ANC being the ANC obviously want to spend on what they consider critical social priorities, and so you've got to find the point that is good for the country.
Yeah.
In between, considering, and so some of the left-wing critique of where we are, massive inequalities, you've got to have spending that helps people develop themselves, and so that's inevitable, and so on. So I suppose as a consequence of that particular fight, we reached budget 3.0. We put it together. It was a lot more conservative, I guess, than 1 and 2. It got through Parliament, but I think it taught everyone a good lesson, and that is, in the absence of a parliamentary majority, people have got to consult and speak to each other.
Yeah.
And the finance minister, to give him his due, went through a very long consultation process this time before getting even to the point of the MTBPS with the entire GNU, because you've got to have a parliamentary majority to get it done. or you can be trapped in perpetual fights, and that's not good for the economy. It's not good for the markets. It's not good for the rand. It's not good for the bonds. It's not good for people's pension funds, and it's not good for growth. So a healthy dose of realism crept in as a consequence of that.
That's very interesting. And do you think it might also be the case that, you and as the DA might have found yourself in this very odd position where you're being greeted in government by, a bunch of guys who have been there for 30 years now. Feels like, and when you first got in there, you didn't realize exactly what would be going on and how the mechanisms of the levers of power were actually pulled. And there were a couple of times, we don't have to rehash them, in which you had some unfortunate incidents in which maybe your other coalition partners were less than forthcoming with their actual intentions. But you have learned from that. You've demonstrated kind of your resolve, your backbone, and then you have also mapped out your environment, come to better understand how the levers of power are actually pulled. And now the DA is in a position over a year into this GNU in which you, as the ministers, are kind of, you don't feel like maybe guests in the ANC's house anymore. Is that maybe also something contributing there?
So, I mean, the thing is, when you enter government for the first time, you don't quite know what you're finding when you get there. You don't know where the civil servants' loyalties are, who they are actually reporting to. Remember, we've had a problem with cadre deployment in this country for 30 years as well, and so on. And so you begin to map out, as you say, pull the levers of power, find the levers of power, find how things work, and these things take time. And at the same time, as you say, things weren't particularly forthcoming, and lines were crossed, and these things happened. But inevitably, unlike other parties in coalition, the DA's view was for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. And I suppose you saw that through the budget fight. Some of the things in BE now that we are tackling head on and headstrong, and multitude of other things. So you learn as you go, but I think the critical thing is that the DA basically showed everyone in the GNU that we're not prepared to be subsumed, and we're not going to let go of our closely held beliefs. And if that means the end of the government, that was that. And that's, the budget took us to the brink, of course. But I think it was probably better for the coalition as a consequence, for the GNU, because everyone now also understands that this is where the DA stands. And you can persuade the DA maybe on this, maybe on that, but you're not going to persuade the DA on its core beliefs, and it's not going to let go of its core beliefs.
And it also shows that you have the ability to bring a certain amount of power to bear, and that you're not going to be kind of pushed over. So you actually you're demanding to be treated with respect, as opposed to being just, kind of yes man that the ANC was hoping.
Yeah, well, I suppose maybe, maybe people think that the driver might be nice, or the salary bump is good, and maybe the ANC's coalition experience in local government in Johannesburg and in Ekurhuleni and so on. I mean, I'm not an ANC spokesperson. I don't know what they think, but I can only presume that what they've done, if I just give you a straight coalition analysis of what they've done, is they have effectively used patronage and blue lights and so on to acquire small parties. And those parties don't want to let go of what they have acquired through the tentacles of the ANC. And that is how they operate, and that's why Joburg is in the kind of disarray that it is. And I think that might have informed the ANC's experience, and maybe they thought, well, we'll just push them around because they won't want to exit. And I think they saw through the budget fight that the DA is quite different to other kinds of coalition partners that they've been working with at a local level. I also think that maybe the ANC's experience is informed by their experience with the National Party in the 1990s. And the DA is not the National Party, and is not. But in spite of the fact that they tried to persuade voters that we were we're not. No. And we're a completely different group of people with a completely different set of values, and a completely different set of policy ideas.
And a completely different history as well, separate from the National Party.
And what they didn't gamble on is that we're all quite plucky because we're quite used to fighting battles and losing and going back and fighting and losing and going back and fighting. And we're quite used to losing our policy battles, but we don't stop fighting those policy battles.
Yeah.
And I think maybe this has taught them that this is a different kind of party to work with. And it's probably good for democracy in the long run that political parties learn to respect each other's differences and understand that you're not going to buy anyone off on policy through positions.
I agree completely. And what you were saying there sparked a kind of memory in me. Because a few years ago, before the Common Sense Before Everything, I had my own small podcast, and one of the people I interviewed was Hanif Hendricks of Al Jamaa, in that podcast was about, what's your plan as an opposition party. He said that the most important thing in South Africa is that it never loses its liberation movement, and that he would always do anything to try and support the ANC. As a member of a different party that's, meant to be in opposition.
If you can send me that clip, I'll use it in the election act.
It's actually sitting on my YouTube. I can do that. But I want to continue this discussion about the kind of dynamics of the GNU. But before we do that, I think as the Deputy Finance Minister, you only deserve the opportunity to sing your praises for an eminently sensible budget that you've managed to get over the line here. And so, can you take us through, what are some of you think are some of the most important kind of parts of the new medium-term budget framework? Maybe take us through the thinking about the change of the interest rate target to 3% as opposed to the kind of band that they were looking at, and what do you think are the biggest successes that you've had?
Yeah. So I think the first thing has been the peaking of debt to GDP because of the dramatic rise. It's we're at the most indebted state the country's been in its history. The previous sort of time we've been heavily indebted was the tail end of the apartheid system when it was around 50-something%. Probably got close to around 60, and then in the democratic era, it started trending down quite dramatically, and we went from being one of the least indebted states in the world to sort of quite up there. And I think we must not underestimate how important that achievement was. And anyone who's ever been trapped in credit card debt, as many people are, and so knows how hard it is to just pay off that credit card. Yeah. And just when you think it's done, something happens and you need to
pull me right back in. Yeah.
So think about that, but think about having 6 trillion rand on your credit card and then saying, no, we're cutting the credit card, we're putting it into the freezer. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing critically is that we are anchoring the budgets, and we said last year we would do this as well, and we've followed through. So it's not just make promises, follow through, because governments make announcements and never do what they say they're going to do. So last year in the NTBPS, we said we would anchor the budget in running a primary surplus. Now, what is the primary surplus? It is basically when non-interest revenue exceeds non-interest expenditure, i.e. the amount of money you take in can cover all of your expenses, except for debt, of course. But now you're not borrowing money anymore to pay for salaries and consumption and even infrastructure and so on. You're borrowing only to pay your interest, which is a far better place to be. And one of the few countries in the world, I was told over the weekend, to have run primary surpluses now 3 years in a row. For the first years, were very small, 0.5% of GDP, around 30 billion rand. But it will double this year. And I think to double the primary fiscal surplus in a single year is quite big. To understand why this is important, South Africa has been running a structural deficit of 5% of GDP. Every year, the government has been, since 2009 on average, been borrowing money equal to 5% of GDP to fund the state. And that has caused the debt to balloon. So to move from the space of extreme deficits and primary deficits to primary surpluses and narrowing the overall deficit, that's pretty big. And so to move from 0.5% of GDP last year to 0.9% this year, 60 billion rand nearly in a primary surplus. And that will grow. And by 2029, the primary surplus will be 2.5% of GDP. So we would have slashed the structural deficit to half of what has been baked in for 15 years. And so it's a big achievement, actually, to go down this path. And it takes courage because politicians love to make announcements about how much money they're spending,
Yeah.
about how much money they're saving.
Yes.
And nobody ever applauds a politician for not spending money. But the truth is, we're now structurally enhancing the economy and saving the country from calamity by going down this path.
Yeah.
So I think that's the second big thing. The third thing is doing the inflation target at the same time. I don't think that anyone, even market watchers, thought that we would be able to peak debt to GDP and reduce our borrowing and lower the inflation target, and still be able to run our primary surpluses and meet all our fiscal targets. Because there's this thing called the GDP deflator, or the nominal GDP. So that grows by inflation every year. Effectively, you print money. Inflation is printing money, and you print money. So if it's 4.5%, your economy should at least grow by 4.5%, and then anything over and above that is your real growth. That's GDP growth.
Yes.
So when you lower your inflation target, what you're saying is we're going to make the amount of money we print less.
Yes.
So all your fiscal metrics then go down. So if you look at our debt to GDP curve, the intention was to go down a lot more aggressively, but because nominal GDP is lower, because we're not printing as much money now, those numbers then have a more gradual decline, but they still decline. But the fact that we did it all in one go is a pretty big deal. And how did we do it? We had extra tax revenue this year. If you look at past years, because of all the expenditure demands from everyone protests outside a government office saying government must do this. And everyone seems to think that, as I said earlier, government must solve every problem. We can't. Normally, when you have extra money, you start plugging gaps. This year, we took the extra money and we put it into the primary surplus, and so on. And so we focused hard on making sure that we use it to peak debt while lowering inflation. Doing those two things at the same time is difficult. But let me get on to inflation, and it's important. Low and stable inflation is good for the economy. It is good for the country. It is good for living standards. It is very good for the living standards of poor people.
Yes.
Now, we live in a country where we have 16 million people in social grants. That's a lot. It is a huge amount. Now, if you want the revolution to come round, just erode the value of their meager earnings, which is social grants and hustling to get by.
Yeah.
And when people can't afford food, then you have the revolution. We've got to do two things at once. We've got to grow the economy to create jobs so that we pull people off grants and into jobs and give them their dignity and let them live lives of value that they can choose for themselves. But you've also got to make sure that you protect the earnings of poor people. So the best way I can describe is prices will go up every year. And whether you're poor or middle class or rich, you need to buy a tube of toothpaste every 2 to 3 weeks.
Yeah.
If you're like me and live by yourself, then 2 to 3 weeks. If you're in a family of 4, probably every week. But you know what I mean. So there's this thing in the economy called aggregate demand, which also helps growth. If inflation erodes the value of the earnings of most of your household, then you're making them choose between toothpaste and apples.
Yes.
And at that point, aggregate demand lowers because people consuming basic goods choose between critical goods, between food and toothpaste, for example. And you don't want that.
Yes.
So the more you can protect the earnings of the poor by not having it eroded through inflation, the better it is. So what we've done with the inflation target effectively is on things, I'll use a simple example, the cost of bread. Under the old targets, the cost of bread would have doubled every 16 years. It will now only double every 24 years.
Wow.
So moving that delta out is quite big.
Yeah.
And I just want to make one last point on inflation. That's quite important. Nobody will invest in a country if they believe that the value of that investment will be eroded by the printing of money.
Yeah.
So it's as simple as that. And South Africa was out of line with our emerging market peers. So developed countries usually target a point target of about 2% on inflation, and then have a tolerance band around that 2%, usually 1% either way. We had a very wide band of 3 to 6%. And when South Africa has a very difficult history of inflation, double-digit inflation through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and into the 90s as well. And then inflation targeting is instituted in the 2000s. Inflation comes down, and it comes down quite dramatically, and it gets in. But because we had a band of 3 to 6%, suddenly it's set in at 6%, not in the band, 6%. So then in 2017, the Reserve Bank governor looks at this, and the Monetary Policy Committee says we're targeting the midpoint of the band, which is 4.5, and then inflation starts settling down at 4.5, and these things have been better for the economy as we go along all the way through, and so slowly it's been getting down, but it's still higher than our emerging market peers. If you're competing with other countries, and I say to an investor, well, this is the value of your investment will be eroded by X amount here, but it'll be eroded by less in another jurisdiction with low inflation, they're going to go there.
Yeah.
And so getting to the 3% targets was a very big decision and a very good decision. And I think I've sort of exhausted the benefits on this topic, but it's very, very important. I mean, there will be criticism, and I've seen lots of people speaking about how it'll affect aggregate demand. I disagree with them. If you take a first-year economics textbook view, using a middle-income country with a large middle class, then maybe some of the criticism would be correct. But the structure of our economy is that we have very, very many poor people who don't earn a lot.
Yes.
And so when you consider the structure of our economy, lower inflation is even more advantageous.
For sure. And I think I want to continue on this topic of the kind of goodness of this budget and how wonderful you are as the Deputy Finance Minister, because we last on Friday received our first rating upgrade in 20 years, which is a great piece of news, but should also be a kind of reminder that it means that for the last 20 years,
It's been going down.
yeah, it's a downhill slope. But that downhill slope, as you point, seems to have reversed, and now we're on the movement back towards investment grade. So, do you think that it's likely that these upgrades will continue to happen given South Africa's fiscal position? And if not, what does South Africa need to do in order to make it, to move it into the kind of investment grade level?
Yeah. So I think that there are a couple of things to understand. I think the ratings agencies have seen the initial signs of life and the potential of reform in the South African economy. Now, it took them a full year of the GNU, more than a year of the GNU, 18 months, 16 months now, to see where we were, and to come to an assessment as to whether or not this government was going to achieve economic reforms, the right kinds of economic reforms. And they've taken a positive view and said, okay, S&P has said, we'll upgrade you. But these reforms have got to push through, and we've got to get results. And the ultimate judge of your results is, do you get economic growth moving? Last year, GDP growth came in at 0.5%. The previous year, it was 0.6%. The population grows anywhere between 1.3 and 1.6. Let's say we just use 1.6 as the marker, 1.6%. Anything under 1.6% means that on average, South Africans are getting poorer every year.
Yeah.
Living standards drop because you're dividing the pie between more and more people. Now, 1.6% growth isn't great, and we must get higher. But the fact that we've been lower than that for such a long period of time now, I think since 2017 on average, it's been well below that. And if you include the COVID period and go all the way to 2009, it's average 1.194%. So we've been getting poorer year in and year out. I think the first critical marker for us, if we are serious about getting to investment grade, is to get GDP growth above population growth, because then living standards stabilize rather than decline.
Yeah.
And then we have got to start getting into decent growth numbers. And getting into decent growth numbers must be the kind of growth that pulls people out of poverty and into jobs, because that also has a big social stabilizing effect. And I think if the agencies start seeing growth tick up, we start meeting our growth forecasts and then exceeding them, and then that'll probably lead to an investment grade. But if we don't get growth moving, then I don't foresee that. So everything hinges on growth.
Okay, and so I'm going to kind of ask you then the opposite side of this. So you've kind of painted out this positive vision. There's actually kind of this fiscal prudence that's set in, that, the budget has done a lot of kind of heroic things, and you've managed to do this in a very short space of time. But there are a few things that South Africans know about how their government spends money, and the biggest truth of it is that they know that their government spends money badly, for whatever reason. And there's kind of two, I think, major classes of this, which is, on the one hand, there's the money that is meant to be spent that is stolen, and you as a minister, or as the kind of in Treasury, you don't really have a lot of say over how, because you give the money, as, correct me if I'm wrong, but you say, okay, these are the budgets that every minister has asked for. I agree that this is the correct budget. You have that money. Then those ministers can go and spend that money, right? But then the other kind of big area that is much less talked about and much less well understood is this kind of BEE premium, the money that it's not being illegally spent, it's just really inefficiently allocated. And by some estimates, we've started this year to see some conversation around how much money that is. I'll use what France puts as his estimate, which is about, let's say, 300 billion rand. And that 300 billion rand, if spent in a wise manner, could do a lot of stuff. It could move our fiscal position into an extraordinarily good place, right? And so how are you, as a DA minister who, you're not committed to the policies that are driving the inefficient spending of money, and you as a party are actually quite set against, set on ending that. What are you doing to try and get the money to be, more efficiently allocated? How do you deal with this big problem?
Yeah. I mean, so allocative efficiency is the job of a treasury, ultimately. So departments make budget bids. The bids are evaluated based on whether or not that expenditure, new expenditure, and you've got recurrent expenditure from every year, would the new expenditure leave the economy better off or worse off? And that's the effective process on which departments make budget bids. And in many cases, the treasury will say no. And very frequently, the treasury says no. And if you look at the more mainstream press and you read any government department complain, they'll say the treasury doesn't want to fund this. The treasury doesn't want to fund that. But the job is allocative efficiency. That's what we've got to do. So that is what is at the core of it. Do we manage every department's budgets personally? No. That every department has its own chief financial officer, its own procurement division, its own staff and supply chain who determine who gets a tender and who gets a contract. And it has its positives and negatives. I mean, the last thing anyone would want, for example, is for well-run municipalities to have a central group of people determining who provides the services there at national government.
Of course, yeah.
So you don't want an all-powerful central government making these decisions. So ultimately, on the fiscal leakages and so on, it's critical for people to understand that you can't undo democracy through bureaucracy. And I'm dead against the idea that you use bureaucracy to undo democracy. People make voting choices, and if you vote a corrupt government in, you'll end up with the fiscal leakages that you've described, and the corruption, and a lot of money gets lost to that, as we know. So that was the first half of your question around that, and people need to make better voting decisions based on the track record of the people they've elected and whether or not they are corrupt or not.
Yeah.
And it's a very, very important thing that people need to confront head on when they vote. On the second half, which is the BE premiums and the premiums in public procurement. So I think France's 300 billion figure also includes the illicit economy and costs and so on. So it's not just that. So the IMF, a lot of people don't like when I mention the IMF, and even on the right these days, you mention the IMF and it's sort of get accused of being part of the New World Order. You mention the left, and you're a neoliberal shill who wants to screw over the poor. When none of those things. Must be clear if it's on the spot. None of the above.
Yeah.
The IMF do good research and they do good work. They've estimated that the BE premiums, the premiums in South African public procurement, is about 1% of GDP. That's 60 billion rand a year, 60 to 70 billion rand a year. So that's what we can save on that front. This means that you need better efficiency in public procurement. You need costs and quality, and those two things need to be considered together. Lots of people say go for the lowest cost as the overarching overarching mechanism. Yes, you can go for the lowest cost, and then every house you build collapses.
Yeah, exactly.
And every bridge you build needs 10 years of repairs. And I'm sure there are very many contractors who love the idea of low cost, because then when the patchwork needs to be done, they're the firms who can do it. So it's quality as well, and that's quite important. So you need the best quality at the lowest price, and that should be the overarching consideration. And the Constitution requires value for money as the overarching consideration. So on the BEE question and the premiums, the reality is that it's costing us a full percentage of GDP. And so the DA has taken up the fight. There are provocative billboards, and I see the Premier of Gauteng is calling us all sorts of names these days. It is what it is, over that particular provocative billboard. But this is a 70 billion rand a year problem. If you were to say to me, what could you do with 70 billion rand? This is why the DA is so strong on solving this problem. There's quite a lot you could do. You could deal with taxes, and you could have a more favorable tax regime for investment. You could resolve a lot of infrastructure problems, water infrastructure, we know, with all the outages, so on. We could build new dams, so many things. So that is that. I mean, on the Treasury side,
maybe just to give a kind of idea of scale of what 70 billion rand is, where if that was just a kind of ministry budget, what does that put you at the scale of?
I have to think about this. It would put you in the top 7, I think. Definitely in the top 10.
Okay,
yes,
so yeah,
top 7, yes.
And just how many ministries are there?
A lot.
Yes.
Too many.
Too many. But you're in at least the top third,
yes.
and you're probably a little bit higher of overall ministries with that amount of money. You could open up a whole new arm of government for that.
Pretty much. Yeah, but I mean, the point is that you could put that money to good use. So the free higher education program, NSFAS, is about 70 billion rand a year. You could double the number of kids who go to university, for example. Wow. In an economy that demands skills. I'm not saying that's how you should spend the money, but that's the effective cost to society. So again, the allocative efficiency question: is society better or worse off as a consequence of these things? And the public procurement front, not so great. I will say this: so the Treasury's job is obviously to implement whatever policies are passed into law, and the law needs to change. But the Treasury doesn't determine BEE and so on. That was all done in the 90s through legislation administered by the Department of Trade and Industry. What they have done to at least put a light on the corruption of all of this is published a public procurement dashboard with this budget as well. And you can now go and literally in every province, in every national department, see exactly who's gotten what contract at what price. And I think hopefully that helps push the conversation on as to whether or not we're getting value for money with the current procurement system. And hopefully some clever people with AI and all sorts of tools these days can now do proper analytics, because we have been able to throw the cold light of day onto every single tender in the country.
Yeah, well, I mean, just on that, it's an incredible achievement that you have there. So congratulations for that. And the kind of last question about the South Africa's fiscal position and the budget and everything is, we've outlined, okay, so we've got this new budget, the whole bunch of new ideas, whole bunch of new restrictions, everything's moving in a positive way. But of course, a budget and government budget and economy does not make, right? And it isn't just that the government in South Africa for the last, let's say, 15 years has spent money badly. That's not the only problem that the South African economy has, because it's a much bigger problem are the kind of structural things that have been created by very poor policy decisions, with the kind of extension of one of the policies we've already talked about, BEE, into the private sector being one of the worst cases of that, essentially a 30% tax on capital entering the market. But you have a whole number of different problems, some of them within government's ability to solve, some of them without. And I want to focus on what I think are maybe the most important set of changes that the government could make with the highest upside benefit in the shortest amount of time, which is looking at the rail networks and the port network in this country and the privatization of those. Why are they not privatized at this point? I mean, because the conversation on privatization of these has been going on for a while now, and there has been a number of promises that have been made that it always seems you get the promise, you get right up until the point of privatization, then the privatization has to be realized, and then it gets backed off, and kind of new promises made, cycle restarts.
Well, not enough people voted DA. There's problem number one. So you're going to solve that problem. That's as a bureaucracy can't undo democracy.
Yes.
So that's the first thing I'd say is the voting decisions didn't change the structure of the politics sufficiently. It changed it enough for us to get to this point, but obviously people need to make voting decisions as well based on what they want. I mean, on the port and freight rail system, there's the three things. There's also energy. So let's start with energy, because on energy you need energy availability tracks economic growth. So you asked about what are the quickest things you can do to get growth moving. And we've got stability of supply. We've had it for a year and a bit, and it's nice to have. We don't have to take turns sharing electricity at the moment, which is fundamentally what load shedding is.
Yes.
Take turns sharing electricity. We don't have to do that for the moment, but we don't have the other half of the equation, and that is stability of pricing. If electricity prices go up anywhere between 9 and 33% a year, and inflation is 4.5% and now 3%, then when you are running a business or a firm in the economy, a bigger portion of your earnings goes to paying for electricity rather than in hiring and in capital expenditure and so on. And so that is the second part of it. Now, we have got to complete the process, unbundling transmission and so on, and moving to the South African wholesale energy markets. The DA sort of proposed these models in the early 2010 of unbundling Eskom and then getting a full competitive energy market with a full private sector build program. Now we've got a nascent private sector build program on renewables and so on, but we need a strong private sector program.
Yeah.
And that is critical, and I think the pressure needs to stay on there. So don't forget energy is what I'm saying, not just port and rail. On ports and rail, with ports, the state did the right thing by concessioning out the Durban Terminal 2. And what we need to get to a point of is more concessions. So if you look anywhere in the world, the Suez Port and Canal, Suez Port is concessioned. The New Jersey, up and down the United States, the ports are owned by the states but concessioned out because the states can own the land, can own the property, but operating and managing these things is not really the expertise of governments in most countries. So what is the holdup? Transnet is the only, as far as I can find globally, vertically and horizontally integrated rail and port owner, operator, employer, and regulator. There's nothing you can Google it. You can go into ChatGPT if you trust AI more than me. And this is sort of, it's a structural problem that's existed through the apartheid era and all the way through now. Unbundling these things is proving to be a very complicated process.
Yeah.
Firstly, so there's that. Then you've got to concession it. So I think that's part of the holdup. But the second part of it is there has been good progress. The RFIs were done, requests for interests, because you don't wake up in the morning and say, private sector, it's yours. I mean, you've got to, it could go to the buddy of Jacob's, the cousin of Jacob Zuma if you're not careful. So you go through a process of an RFI, and it's a globally recognized process, request for information. What does the market tell you they're prepared to take on? Where is their market interest? From the RFI, you go to an RFP, request for proposal, and then you determine who gets what. And you've got to make rational decisions based on expertise, because this is economic superstructure. It's not sort of some guy who happens to be linked to a political party. You probably don't want those guys running your freight rail and so on and your ports. So it is a process. And I am get very frustrated, but then I often speak to the folk in international institutions, market-oriented institutions, like the IMF and World Bank, and they say, well, so you're doing the fastest tearing up of regulation they've seen in countries with similar problems. So it's sort of not moving quickly enough for our liking, but by global standards, moving very quickly. On freight rail, in December, Transnet published its network statement, which enabled open access freight rail, i.e., it's not just Transnet's trains the way you have to use Transnet's trains and nobody else's. They've now given out time slots and say the private sector may put their own trains on our tracks and run them on our network, which is a big leap forward. So there's privatization right there.
Yes.
As an example. And it is happening as we speak. 11 slots have been given out on the major lines. That'll hopefully help freight rail volumes recover. Durban Terminal 2 is now, the litigation is completed. And that was part of the hold-up, litigation. We have entrenched judicial review. In the United States, you don't have entrenched judicial review. You don't, government takes a decision, it's taken a decision. You can challenge it in constitutional grounds, but there's no entrenched judicial review and process, for example. And many countries don't have. We have it in the Constitution that every administrative act, rightly, is justiciable and therefore can be taken on review. So these things all hold up. We've chosen a particular kind of democracy. We've chosen a particular kind of setup, and voters have made certain choices. And those three things together make things very slow.
Yeah. So that's why it takes
forever. But we've made good, think about it. Last year, this time, Durban Terminal 2 was wrapped up in litigation, and people were saying it's going to only be concluded in 10 years. And therefore, the port's concessioning program has failed. A year later, that is now wrapped up. Last year, this time, there was nothing about private. It was a conceptual idea that the private sector would be running its own trains on Transnet's lines. It's now 11 slots have been allocated, and the private operators have to get their trains onto the tracks.
And, maybe I guess that the answer contractually for you has to be yes, but is the reason why, there's this haste in the last year because maybe the makeup of government has changed and there's some plucky underdogs who are coming and putting pressure on these old, slow dinosaurs,
There's a combination of things.
Yeah.
I think that the biggest thing is the election result itself. Nothing focuses a politician's mind on the future, quite like losing an election. And you had a one-party dominant state where the dominant party suddenly lost an election. So suddenly these things are not just things that need to be done because business says we've got a crisis and we can't get our things out of the country, but because if you don't grow the economy, the levers of power you still hold, you're going to lose. Yeah. That's one part of it. The second part of it is maybe that they're just so irritated by having these plucky DA people all around them all the time that if they realize if they grow the economy quickly enough, maybe they can get at some point in the future election get rid of these plucky DA folk running around. I don't know what they think, but of course my short answer is yes. Of course it is.
It could only be the DA. You were contractually obligated to say that without the DA, no improvements would ever have been made to South Africa at any point. Understand that. But I think this takes us back into where I wanted the conversation to go, which is on this relationship between the ANC and the DA. And you wear two hats as a person because you aren't just the deputy minister of finance, but you are also the deputy chair of the federal executive. I'm correct. I've given you the correct.
Yes.
Perfect. And so you have you also have to think about the kind of strategy of and I did say at the beginning of the interview, this would be as you would be talking as the Minister of Finance, but I'd request that for a brief period you put your FedEx cap on.
I think we've crossed that line several times.
Okay, great. And so, the first kind of thing that I want to talk to you about in terms of the GNU is... You were talking about here how the ANC has realized that maybe getting growth rates up is the thing that will save it from its own electoral.
Well, not everyone. I mean, let me be clear. I mean, it's tricky because the ANC is not a single consolidated entity. So my analysis for years even before being in government, I think it holds up still, is that the ANC is 5 organizations in one. There is an urbane, sophisticated group. It used to actually be the biggest part of the ANC. That's now longer there. There's the zonification of the ANC with Jacob Zuma and the rural sort of Premiers League. There is that sort of the rural barons of the ANC. There are the sort of pragmatic leftists. There are the dogmatic leftists. And then the unionists are in that one or other camp of that.
Yes.
And then you've got just a straight up criminal class.
Yeah.
So it's not as so when I say that, I mean basically the people who currently run the place as best they can inside the ANC. You know, sort of the penny at times drops, and yes, we've got to get growth moving.
Yeah, but do you think, you know, one of the things that I think about here as a kind of pollster, you know, before I became the executive producer here, I was part of director of research of a polling group, and I think a lot about, you know, the kind of dynamics between parties. And one of the things that I think of as, you know, kind of this question about the DA and the ANC is obviously that the DA wants to come in, and it's always had, rightfully so, a focus on pro-growth policies, and it wants to implement a kind of pro-growth package in South Africa to get the South African growth rate up. But now you're the junior partner to this big kind of, it looks like a failing organization, an organization that seems to be struggling more and more with the paradox of its own existence, and the weight of its own existence. You know, I've often described it as this lumbering behemoth that, you know, is slowly moving towards Bethlehem, and yet you might be offering them potentially a road back to 50%, because one of the problems that junior partners have found in coalitions internationally through history has been that if you are a good and pragmatic and achieve things, oftentimes your achievements get stolen by the, you know, bigger party. And if the achievements are seen to be, you know, through the achievements of both parties, then the bigger party usually ends up on top. So is there a worry within the DA that what you might be doing by, you know, being so hardcore and so insistent and fighting so hard for your policies is in fact you're handing the ANC back the keys to their own survival?
Yeah. Look, I mean, from the outset, and we've said this all the way through, and even the junior, our job is not to rescue the ANC from itself. Our job is to do what we were elected to do by the voters, and that is to push hard on reform, to govern well, to govern cleanly, and to do the best we can. And the truth is, if you had a DA majority government unconstrained by coalition politics, a lot of decisions that are dragging could be taken very quickly, because there is no internal dissensus in the DA on the rapid fire kind of reforms that need to be done.
Yeah.
So, you know, and so if an SOE is resistant to the kind of changes we want to make, just change the board and bring in the last ever CEO of that SOE. Yeah. I mean, that's the kind of rapid fire shock therapy that we would do. So what can we do? We've got to do what's best for the country on the front of growth. And we've got to make sure that is that. But I think that the South African experience is not the global experience. So this is not Europe.
Yeah. And
the South African electorate is not the European electorate. Voters can see who is working and who is not. Voters can see who is fighting every day for growth and who is not. And I think that's why, if you look at polling, why is the DA polling so strongly? And what has happened in that time is that voters have actually seen that the DA's core promise, when we get into government, we won't steal, we won't engage in tenderpreneurship, we won't be corrupt, we won't buy new cars, you know, all the little and big things.
Yeah.
We've kept our core promise to the electorate on that front. And everyone understands that we don't control the critical levers that we would like to control. If we could, pull those levers. The levers we are pulling every day. And so you see the DA folk working very, very hard every day, everywhere. They're almost inescapable. And so on. And I think we've shown the public what it means to take governing seriously. So I think that has put us in good stead. And that's why people trust us. And in going into the local government elections, I suspect you'll see people trust us even more. So South African electorates, strangely, can tell the political parties apart. Whereas in Europe, you all get lumped together.
Yes.
In South Africa, and I suppose maybe it's because of the structure of the government, and two ministers can do in the same policy area can pull in completely different areas. This is not a characteristic of the GNU. I mean, during Jacob Zuma's era, we had the New Growth Path, which was sort of socialism and industrial policy rolled into one.
Yeah.
And one hand going to the far left, and you had the NDP going to the center right with Trevor Manuel and his crowd putting this document together that everyone liked, the New Growth Path that everyone disliked, and these two things were true at once.
Yeah.
So it's not new. That it's just the difference is now that the political parties are using the levers they have to do their policies. And maybe it's just the structure of the South African government that helps voters see these things differently.
So you're not scared that
I was at the start, but I've watched voter reaction, and South African voters are not dumb. Voters can see what's happening. Voters can see who's picking the right fights. And I think for as long as we do stand for what we stand for, be authentically who we are, and which is the center-right, pro-growth, pro-market party in South Africa, that is in favor of treating people as individuals and not defining them by the color of their skin, all of those sorts of things. As long as we continue to be who we are, and as long as we continue to show that we are better at governing, I think that the electorate would reward us. I think that if we are bad at government and change our values, then the risk you describe is exactly what will happen.
And there's an interesting kind of question that arises there, because I had a conversation with Moeletsi Mbeki not too long ago, in which he made, and you'll be very happy to know this, he made the declaration that he thinks the ANC is dead and that the DA is the future of the country. That's set in stone to him. That there's no question that that's going to happen. But his question is, what is this DA thing? Because he posits this idea that liberalism is only a kind of, he says, I think the word he used was native to the English-speaking white South Africans, that in fact, because it's a colonial idea that comes with the British colonists, and from there is spread out into South Africa, and that the DA is going to have this really difficult problem that it finds where, in actual fact, the average South African might not be as good a liberal as we want them to be, and so the DA might be championing a minority ideology, which will just puts it on the back foot the whole time. What do you think about this?
Okay, so I think that a political party needs a core set of values and ideas, and the DA has a few core sets of ideas that stem from liberalism. The first is the market economy, and the fact that the best way to allocate resources in the economy is to let businesses and firms and households decide, and not the state. And that's sacrosanct. The second is that you treat in a country as ethnically, religiously, and however it's linguistically diverse as South Africa is. If you try to slice South Africa up by its various groups, you might as well then not bother with elections, have a census and say, you get X amount, you get X amount, and then figure it out afterwards. That is not an effective way to make government policy. It is not an effective way because people can hold two identities or four identities, whatever is at once, and it's up to them to decide. It's not for the government to put you into a box and so on. And where Moeletsi Mbeki is wrong is that he presumes that it is the government's job to decide what box people go into, which is no different to what the guys pre-94 were doing. You happen to be Indian, therefore you must live in this area. You'll get this standard of education. You'll do this kind of job. And these are the things you're good at because of what your people did 400 years ago in India, whatever. Using myself as an example there. It doesn't fit. It doesn't enable us to take advantage of human talent. And talent is distributed not because of your race or your ethnicity, and so on. It's distributed as it's distributed. And so the only way you can govern a place as complicated and diverse as South Africa is according to our principles, because the only way it can be governed. It's why we ended up with a liberal constitution. Now, if you want to say that doesn't work, then we've got to tear up the entire constitution. I mean, that's the crux of the argument. So I don't think that it works. I also think that voters it's important for a political party to have a clearly defined set of values, a clearly defined set of ideals and ideas, and so that it can make decisions for society and government based on those values. So when I look at things and I have to influence decisions and so on, I'm looking at it through, is this market orientated? Is it good for growth? Will it result in labor absorption? And so on? Because that's the framework from which I work from. If I were to abandon that and sort of have some kind of weird, South African nativist or whatever kind of, it would not work. And we've seen for the last 30 years how ditching some of these things, and they end up with race-based policy and so on, because we want to box people into groups. We want to say, because you are from this group, that is that. We want to say to people, because of the color of your skin, you can be perpetually empowered. Never mind that the empowerment systems have only empowered and a small elite and left most of those folk poor. It doesn't work. So the only way you can do so is by treating people as individuals. And so when you start treating people as individuals, then you can start doing what actually needs to be done. And consensus in the commentary class now heading towards this. We need to target poverty, not race, for empowerment. For example, you can only do that if you have a liberal framework from which to work, because you can then say, even if on aggregate a group is poor, you don't want to empower the elites of any group. You want to make sure that your policies target the poor. So I think that analysis is wrong. I think that to call it a colonial imposition is not reflective of that. And also, let me say this: what is the dominant counter ideology to what the DA stands for
in South
Africa? Well, there's two. One is the sort of hard African nationalism of the MK type party, and then it is the hard communism of the SACP and others on the left. Nationalism is not a unique ideology to any continent or to any ethnicity. It rears its head all through history. And communism is also equally a European construct brought here, Marx and Engels, good Germans, Russian Revolution, and the ANC guys from the harder left all learned their Marxism from the Soviet Union and so on. So and they governed, influenced by this European ideology for 30 years, and nobody ever said they need to drop the European ideology. Because ideas don't matter based on the ethnicity of the people who produce them. It's based on empirical testing as to whether they produce positive results, which liberalism does.
Well, I think I have so many more questions, but unfortunately you've been too kind and given me too much time to ask them, and I've just stolen it all away. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today, Ashor. It was a fantastic interview, and good luck with everything that you have to deal with, and good luck with the next few budgets that you have to write.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I've been Gabriel Makin, and this has been Talking Sense.